His name, once whispered with reverence in the corridors of power, was erased from the records as if he had never existed. He was a master of the law, a manipulator of loopholes and statutes, but he died entangled in a legal web he himself helped weave, never realizing who the spider was. This is the story of how a brilliant and corrupt lawyer tried to use the system against Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, only to discover that the judicial trap he relied on already belonged to his target. We delve into a world of political corruption, legal trickery, and the cold precision of a mind that operated both in the shadows of the streets and in the dusty corridors of the courts. The lesson is timeless. When trying to corner a king in his own territory, one must first be sure who truly holds the deed to the land. This man's downfall was no accident, but the inevitable result of underestimating the depth of Bumpy's reach. The story begins in the fall of 1957, a time when the federal government, under pressure from public opinion and investigative committees, was intensifying its war against organized crime. Ambitious prosecutors saw the conviction of a high-profile figure as a springboard for their careers. Enter Arthur Finley, a criminal defense attorney of immense talent and utterly flexible morality. Finley was known in New York as the man who could get anyone off any charge, provided the price was right. He built his reputation defending mobsters, but his true genius lay in his ability to manipulate the system itself. He knew every corrupt judge, every bribbable clerk, and every cop willing to lose evidence. He didn't win cases in court. He won them behind the scenes even before the jury was selected. His arrogance was proportional to his success, and in Bumpy Johnson, he saw the opportunity for his masterpiece. Finley's plan was wickedly ingenious. He approached Bumpy not as an adversary, but as a potential ally. He warned him about a new federal task force specifically focused on Harlem operations, painting a grim picture of impending investigations and inevitable federal charges. Finley's offer was to appear as a legal advisor, a guide through the legal maze. His true plan, however, was to create the very crisis he was foreseeing. Using his contacts in the prosecutor's office, he was anonymously feeding selective information about Bumpy's operations, enough to instigate a real investigation, but not enough to lead to an immediate conviction. His strategy was to become indispensable to Bumpy, drag him into a legal quagmire of his own making, and in the process bleed his finances dry with exorbitant fees, while secretly negotiating a favorable deal for himself with the feds in exchange for his ultimate cooperation. Bumpy Johnson listened to Finley's presentation in his office with the same impassive quiet that so many before him had mistaken for passivity. He let Finley speak, unroll his elaborate carpet of warnings, veiled threats, and promises of salvation. Bumpy, a man who had survived gang wars, prisons, and constant betrayal, possessed a finely tuned deception detector. He didn't just hear Finley's words, he heard the music beneath them, the melody of greed, arrogance, and predatory ambition. He recognized the type, the man who believes himself the smartest in the room, who sees others as mere instruments for his own advancement. Bumpy already knew Finley's reputation. His information network, which stretched from the streets of Harlem to the cleaning offices of government buildings, had already alerted him to Finley's secret meetings with a young and ambitious federal prosecutor. Finley wasn't offering a shield, he was selling a poisoned sword, and Bumpy knew exactly where he intended to stick it. Arthur Finley's fatal mistake was a fundamental error of assumption. He presumed that Bumpy Johnson's power was confined to the Harlem ecosystem, to the world of street violence and the informal economy. He saw Bumpy as a tribal king, powerful in his small domain, but ignorant and vulnerable when confronted with the sophisticated complexities of the legal and political system. Finley failed to conceive that Bumpy's reach could extend to his own world, the world of expensive suits, backroom deals, and white-collar corruption. He completely underestimated Bumpy's ability to adapt and expand his influence. Bumpy understood that, to survive in America, power needed to flow through all channels, not just the illegal ones. Over the years, he had quietly invested in politicians, judges, and public officials, not through crude bribes, but by building relationships, financing campaigns, and collecting the secrets and debts that were the true currency of power in New York. Finley was trying to play chess on a board he thought he knew, unaware that Bumpy owned the board, the pieces, and the very room where the game was being played. Bumpy decided that the best way to deal with a snake wasn't by cutting off its head, but by making it poison itself with its own venom. He accepted Finley's help. He hired him as his special advisor, paying him a generous advance that made Finley's eyes gleam with greed. He began meeting regularly with the lawyer, feigning concern, sharing seemingly confidential information about his operations. However, every piece of information Bumpy provided was carefully fabricated. They were half-truths and false leads, designed to appear valuable, but which in reality led the federal investigators Finley was helping down dead ends, to discredited informants, and to phantom operations. Bumpy was using Finley as a conduit to wage his own disinformation war against the task force, turning his enemy's weapon into his own shield. Finley, blinded by his ego and the ease with which Bumpy seemed to trust him, proudly passed on each piece of trash, believing he was weaving the net that would catch Bumpy, when in reality he was getting entangled in it. Bumpy's intelligence lay not only in his ability to read people, but in his deep understanding of power structures. He knew that the legal system, like the streets, operated on the basis of influence and favoritism. While Finley focused on prosecutors and federal agents, Bumpy activated his own network, one that was older, deeper, and far more subtle. He didn't try to stop the investigation, he guided it. A judge who owed his position to a campaign donation from one of Bumpy's legitimate businesses signed warrants that were intentionally flawed. A clerk, whose son Bumpy had pulled out of trouble with the law years earlier, misplaced a crucial document. Bumpy wasn't fighting the system head-on, he was undermining it from within, using the same tactics of corruption and patronage that men like Finley believed to be their exclusive domain. He was demonstrating that the power of Harlem didn't stop at 110th Street, but seeped into the granite foundations of the very buildings that represented law and order. The genius of Bumpy's strategy lay in his patience. He allowed Finley and the Fed's investigation to drag on for months. He continued to pay Finley's exorbitant fees, treating him with respect and deference, constantly feeding the lawyer's belief that he was in control. During this time, Bumpy was building his own case, not against the task force, but against Arthur Finley. He used his own contacts to document every secret meeting Finley had with the prosecutors, to record every piece of false information Finley passed on, and most importantly, to track the money. Bumpy knew that Finley's greed was his greatest vulnerability. He ensured that payments to Finley were made in a way that would later be impossible to explain as legitimate legal fees, using shell companies and cash transactions that looked exactly like money laundering. He wasn't just defending himself, he was building his enemy's gallows, piece by piece, while the enemy himself whistled gleefully, believing he was building a palace. The trap was set with a legal precision that Finley himself would have admired. Bumpy used one of his political contacts to leak a story to a respected newspaper columnist, but not about the investigation against him. The story was about a dangerous leak within the federal prosecutor's office, a leak that was compromising investigations and putting agents at risk. The article didn't name Finley, but it provided enough details about a prominent lawyer with ties to the mafia who was acting as a double agent, creating panic and distrust within the task force. Suddenly, Finley went from a valuable asset to a toxic liability. His former allies in the prosecutor's office began to distance themselves, fearing that their association with him could destroy their careers. The same ambition that led them to use Finley now led them to abandon him to protect themselves. Finley's power base, built on cynical relationships, began to crumble. The turning point was as silent as it was devastating. One Tuesday morning, 2 FBI agents, the same ones Finley used to secretly meet for coffee, showed up at his luxurious office, not with a request for information, but with an arrest warrant. The charge wasn't leaking information, but something far simpler and far dirtier: money laundering and tax evasion, based on the very payments he had greedily received from Bumpy Johnson. The architecture of Bumpy's trap was revealed. The financial transactions, which Finley believed to be the fruit of his genius, were presented as proof of his own criminality. The half-truths he had given the feds were reframed as evidence that he was an active participant in the conspiracy, not an informant. Bumpy used the justice system itself to turn Finley's actions against him, framing him not as a manipulator, but as a white-collar gangster. The consequence for Finley was total annihilation. His world, built on the illusion of control and intellectual superiority, imploded. He found himself abandoned by his contacts, stripped of his license to practice law, and facing the same federal charges he boasted he could protect others from. He tried to fight, to use his skills to defend himself, but discovered that all the doors that had once opened for him were now locked and barricaded. The judges he had bribed now refused to hear his cases. The politicians he had funded didn't return his calls. He had become radioactive. The ultimate irony was that for his defense, he had to hire a mediocre and overworked lawyer, the kind of lawyer he used to despise. In court, he was confronted with a meticulously constructed case, a case bearing the hallmark of Bumpy Johnson's precision and patience. Finley was convicted and sentenced to a long term in federal prison, the very fate from which he had vowed to save Bumpy. The message conveyed by this episode was profound. It unequivocally demonstrated that Bumpy Johnson's power had evolved. He was no longer just a king of Harlem. He was a citywide power player, whose influence extended far beyond the streets and into the corridors of power. He proved he could confront his enemies on their own turf, be it a dark alley or a federal courtroom, and defeat them by their own rules. The downfall of Arthur Finley became legendary in legal and underworld circles, a cautionary tale about the folly of underestimating an opponent based on class or educational prejudices. It showed that Bumpy was capable not only of physical violence, but of a far more sophisticated form of destruction, annihilation through the very system his enemies wielded. The historical impact was the solidification of Bumpy's reputation as an untouchable figure, not only because of the fear he inspired, but because of the strategic intelligence he demonstrated. He taught a new generation of prosecutors, politicians, and rival gangsters that going against him required more than just strength or cunning in a single field. It required an understanding that he operated on multiple chessboards simultaneously. Finley's story served as a deterrent, making many who might have tried to challenge him in the years to come much more cautious. They realized that any attack would have to be perfect, as Bumpy had the ability to find the slightest flaw in a plan and turn it into a catastrophic failure for its author. The symbol left by this confrontation was not a body, but a legal process, a pile of legal documents that told a story of punished arrogance. Finley's name, once synonymous with power and influence, became a footnote, an example of a brilliant man who catastrophically overestimated himself. Bumpy not only survived Finley's trap, he took it over, redesigned it, and used it to capture its creator. He allowed his enemy to believe he was in control until the very last moment, a psychological tactic that made the final fall all the more devastating. The lesson was clear. True mastery in the game of power lies not in having the best weapons, but in making your enemy disarm themselves willingly. The destruction of Arthur Finley was a testament to Bumpy's philosophy. Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. Bumpy gave Finley rope, money, and false information, everything he needed to build his own noose. Bumpy's patience, his willingness to play the long game while his opponent sought a quick victory, was key to his triumph. He understood that arrogance is a kind of blindness, and the best way to defeat a blind man is not by fighting him, but simply by letting him walk toward the precipice he is unable to see. Finley's downfall was not just a victory for Bumpy, it was an affirmation of his worldview. Ultimately, the saga of Arthur Finley is more than a story of crime and punishment. It's an exploration of the nature of power in a complex society. It shows that the lines between legal and illegal are often blurred, and that influence can be a more potent weapon than any law or statute. Bumpy Johnson prevailed, not because he was more brutal, but because he was more cunning, more patient, and possessed a deeper understanding of the interconnected web of obligations, secrets, and debts that truly governs the world. He didn't just defeat an enemy, he absorbed and surpassed his enemy's very source of power, proving himself the ultimate manipulator in a game full of manipulators.